The classical age of Greek history would come to an end in 338 BC with the rise of what historians have called the Hellenistic period. Now, classical Greek culture is sometimes called Hellenic culture. This is because the Greeks called themselves Hellenes, and they called Greece Hellas, after the legendary hero Helen, from whom they claimed descent. Now, in fact, the Hellenes were just one of a number of such groups. Others that we've talked about are the Ionians and the Dorians. But since the Romans labeled them all Greeks, this lumping together has stuck with us. Hellenistic means Greek-like, and refers to the blending of elements of Western civilization with Eastern civilization. The Hellenistic period lasted from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC until the conquest of the last of the Hellenistic kingdoms, which was Cleopatra's Egypt in 30 BC. Sparta's victory in the Peloponnesian War was hardly a victory at all, since they were so exhausted by the war that they were a shell of their former selves. The 30 tyrants in Athens only lasted until 403, when they were overthrown, and a final period of democracy was instituted. This is the democracy that killed Socrates, and would last a century and a half before it was conquered by the Romans. Sparta proved incapable of suppressing the Athenians, and they were soon also challenged by the city of Thebes. Thebes asserted itself as the primary Greek polis for a period of time until the 330s. Philip II was the king of Macedon, and he saw the Greek disunity and recognized that they were ripe for conquest. Macedonia was a semi-Greek state north of the classical Greek city-states on the Balkan Peninsula. Unlike a Greek polis, Macedonia was ruled over by a king. Philip altered the basic parameters of a phalanx to make a much larger unit, equipped with much longer spears, known as pikes, that jutted much farther in front of the phalanx than a contemporary Greek one. With this military development, he invaded Greece in 338 BC. He won the Battle of Chaeronea and united the Greek world. He created the League of Corinth, an alliance in which the members could rule themselves, but had to follow Philip's foreign policy. It appears as if Philip's great goal was to unite the Greeks into a super army and lead it against the Persians as a punishment for the Persian invasion a century before. Philip never got to launch his Persian invasion because he was assassinated by a jealous lover at his daughter's wedding in 336. Philip's son, Alexander, seized power and decided to undertake his father's expedition, both to legitimize his own rule and to solidify the support of the army behind him. Alexander was only 20 years old at the time, and he would die when he was 33, but in his brief life, he would accomplish more than almost anyone else in human history. Alexander was intelligent, dedicated, and energetic. He was tutored by no less than Aristotle, and he reportedly slept with a copy of the Iliad, having devoted himself to living a life that Achilles would have led. Once he set out on the path to conquest, he hardly looked back before defeating the Persians and uniting the eastern Mediterranean with the Near East. He conquered Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia, before pressing on deep into Asia all the way to India. His conquests and the route he took are depicted on the map here. He began with a force of only 35,000 men in 334 BC, and yet outwitted and defeated armies triple his size in 3 great battles, at the Battle of Granicus River, Issus, and Gaugamela. He assumed the title of Pharaoh of Egypt, then he became the King of Persia in 329. In fact, he was finally only limited by his own war-weary mutinous soldiers, who refused to press on even farther into India at the end of Alexander's campaign. Alexander returned to Babylon to prepare for his next campaign, probably into Arabia, and he also began to rule according to Near Eastern customs rather than Greek or Macedonian ways. In any event, he died of a sudden fever in 323, ending all hopes of further conquest. Alexander had spent his time conquering, not preparing for the future, and his death left a major power vacuum. His generals struggled for power in a bloody civil war that lasted about 40 years and left every member of Alexander's family dead. In the end, 3 generals established dynasties in what had been Alexander's empire. The first was the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece. The second was the Seleucid kingdom in Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia. Lastly, there was the Ptolemaic kingdom, which controlled Egypt and Palestine. The Greek city-states, so recently conquered by Philip and Alexander, reasserted their independence, forming the Aeolian League in the north and the Achaean League in the south for protection. The boundaries between these various successor state kingdoms and alliances shifted regularly, and the political unity established by Alexander did not last long. It was only when the Romans established their rule over the area that unity was reestablished. At the same time, many Greeks moved to these new states, founding and expanding some of the cities established by Alexander and his generals. These cities proved to be important centers of trade between Europe and Asia, and were facilitated by the upper-class Greeks who migrated, therefore creating this Hellenistic period of blending between Greek and Eastern. The most famous of these cities was Alexander's final resting place and was named after him, Alexandria in Egypt. At its height, this city had 1 million people, and had the Pharos, which is a lighthouse built that was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Just as important, Alexandria was an intellectual powerhouse, and a museum and library were founded there that served as a repository for knowledge from all over the world. When we think of the culture of the Hellenistic period, we don't concentrate on literary works, but rather on scientific endeavors. Hellenistic science developed the beginnings of the scientific method and led to the specialization and professionalization of knowledge. During the Hellenistic period, we begin to see specialists rather than generalists, as the entire body of available knowledge began to outstrip the capacities of any single individual. The Greeks knew that the earth was round, despite what some 21st century Americans think the Greeks, or Columbus for that fact, knew. Eratosthenes, who lived between 276 and 196, used his knowledge of geometry to accurately establish the circumference of the earth. Aristarchus argued that the sun was the center of the universe, and that the earth travels around the sun, causing night and day. His theory, however, was rejected in favor of Aristotle's, which posited that the earth was the center. Hipparchus is the inventor of the astrolabe, a complex device that allowed the heavens to be accurately observed and recorded. The math branch of geometry was also established by the Greeks, in this case Euclid, who recorded his theorems in his book titled The Elements. Archimedes of Syracuse furthered mathematics by determining the value of pi, which is the ratio of the circumference of a circle to its area. Archimedes was also a practical scientist who developed a number of devices based on his knowledge of mechanics. He developed the laws of pulleys and levers as labor-saving devices. He also invented the Archimedes screw, which used a hand crank to lift water to higher levels than ever previously available. A few minutes ago, I mentioned Greeks who migrated to the east, and they brought their art and architecture with them. These styles influenced the people they came into contact with, but were also altered themselves. One of the standard features of the new Hellenistic cities were vast theaters that one generally associates with Greece. The Greeks also brought their orders of columns with them, especially the ornate Corinthian column. In addition, the Greeks spread their style of sculpture, which prioritized naturalism and realism. Over the course of the Hellenistic period, sculptures made leaps and bounds, depicting figures in a number of different poses. Whereas classical Greek sculpture tended to show figures in repose, Hellenistic ones enjoyed theatrical poses, people in action, and was rather dynamic. They also often depicted non-ideal representations of the daily lives of common people. The 3 most famous Hellenistic sculptures are the Venus of Milo, Laocoon, and the Winged Victory at Samothrace. In my discussion of Greek religion, I mentioned the origins of the mystery religions. These cults expanded greatly during the Hellenistic period, partly at least in response to a crisis of faith in traditional religion, as a result of the disasters of the late 400s and 300s. Many of these religions came from the Near East, such as Mithraism, whose rituals involved the sacrifice of bulls. These religions tended to promise an afterlife, which contributed to their popularity. Philosophy also began to shift away from the speculations of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to a new emphasis on the life of the individual. 3 major schools of thought appeared. The first was Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus. He taught that a happy or good life was one spent in pleasure. He was not a hedonist, however, who encouraged unbridled passions, but rather taught that the pleasures of friendship and of the mind were better than the fleeting pleasures of the body. The second school was Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, and named after the building, the Stoa, where he taught. Stoicism encouraged the suppression of desire in favor of an enlightened apathy. If this could be achieved, misfortunes wouldn't be as devastating to an individual. Stoics believed that divine providence governed the universe. Therefore, people ought to respect one another, since we are all under the same rules, and therefore we should tolerate different peoples and beliefs. A third school was skepticism, which questioned whether any certainty was possible. Skepticism was always a minority movement, since it offered no comfort for the difficulties of life. Instead, Stoicism became rather popular, and ultimately dominated the philosophical mindset of the Roman Empire.